It's my pleasure to introduce an excellent panel to discuss an immensely important subject, controversial subject. That is the role of both inward and outward investment in U.S. economic growth and its global competitiveness. Investment in the United States has been flagging. It is at its lowest since 1999. The federal and state governments welcome foreign investment and indeed compete for it through the Select America program, which encourages foreigners to invest here, of course, while maintaining national security protections. At the same time, U.S. investment in foreign, fast developing markets is extremely important because the growth of our mature domestic market has slowed. We need access to foreign consumers, yet our companies face many problems as they try to establish their presence abroad and do business. Each of our panelists brings unique strengths and perspectives to this discussion. Brad Jensen is Professor of International Business and Economics at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He is the author of the book on U.S. services trade called Global Trade in Services, Fear, Facts, and Offshoring. I have a copy if you want to take a look. And much other highly regarded work. He is a senior fellow of the Peterson Institute for International Economics here in Washington. And I have, as he mentioned, the pleasure of working together with him as co-director of this program, trade policy program, as part of the center's effort here. Christine Bliss is the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Services and Investment at USTR. She is an attorney and a very skilled negotiator. She has built an exceptionally competent team to represent U.S. interests in negotiations of bilateral and regional trade agreements, starting with the FTAs with Singapore and Chile, running to the current negotiations for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, an international services agreement, and a trade agreement with Europe. Linda Andros is Legislative Counsel for the United Steelworkers. She is an attorney with extensive experience, including Legislative Counsel of Public Citizen, Senior Associate at Dewey Ballantine, and Senior Advisor in the Commerce Department's Office of the Chief Counsel for Import Administration. Ambassador John Veroneau is co-chair of the International Trade and Finance Practice at Covington, LLP. Previously, he served as General Counsel of USTR, then Deputy United States Trade Representative. He has been Assistant Secretary of Defense, and before that served as Legislative Director to Senator Bill Cohen, Majority Leader Bill Frist, and as Chief of Staff for Senator Susan Collins. Hill rats can do good, eventually. I'd like to begin by asking Brad Jensen to provide an overview of the U.S. Foreign investment, of the role of U.S. foreign investment in the U.S. economy. Then ask Christine Bliss to outline the administration's efforts to improve the conditions for investment, particularly U.S. outward investment. Linda Andros will raise issues of concern as to both outward and inward investment, and John Veroneau will wrap based on his extensive experience with foreign investment policy, negotiations, and very substantial transactions. So, Brad, you want to kick it off?
Thanks, Bob. So I thought I would just give a couple minutes of a primer on how economists think about foreign direct investment and try to tee up some issues and also put forward some facts that may get touched upon by my co-panelists as we go forward. So foreign direct investment is the owning of plant, property, or equipment as opposed to stock or other financial instruments. And FDI plays a really crucial role in the U.S. economy. I guess that's the big point that I want to make. A couple of important terms or conceptual distinctions that I'd like to make before I delve in is the difference between inward FDI, that's foreign companies investing in the United States, and outbound FDI, which is U.S. companies investing abroad. That's one distinction. Another distinction is what we talk about as horizontal or market-seeking FDI. This is when companies are going abroad largely to access foreign consumers. And the other type of FDI that economists talk about is vertical or resource-seeking foreign direct investment. That is when a company is looking for either lower cost labor, lower cost access to materials, or lower cost access to intellectual property. Okay, so that's vertical FDI. I think maybe the most important point to understand about foreign direct investment and the firms that do it is that these multinationals are very different than the average firm. Very different. They are just much better. They have a suite of very desirable characteristics that make them, really important firms. And the way economists think about this is these multinationals have some kind of special advantage. They either have a brand or a design or a production process or a patent that makes them more competitive. It makes them more competitive domestically. And then this specialness, this competitive advantage, leads them to want to exploit that advantage in foreign markets. Okay? So these MNCs, they're different. Whether it's a US multinational company or a foreign multinational company, these are the best firms in the world. Okay, so firms pursue FDI when they can't export to a market. Okay, so that's the market seeking, that's the horizontal motivation. They can't export to a market either because of high transportation costs or because of policy impediments like tariffs. Okay, that can drive a firm to pursue foreign direct investment instead of exporting. Or another reason is firms can't import at arm's length from a foreign supplier. Again, because of some proprietary technology or some special production process, some special thing about the firm, it's very difficult to import what it wants to import at arm's length. So there it would pursue foreign direct investment. And the source of these transactions costs, as we call them, could be the nature of the product. It's very special. Or it could be the nature of the institutional environment in the foreign country. There's little protection for intellectual property. The courts don't work well. These are all motivations for pursuing foreign direct investment. Some research that I've done suggests that there's important interactions between product characteristics and country characteristics that drive FDI. So inbound FDI is an important source of R&D activity in the United States. It's an important source of U.S. exports, okay? And it's a source of good jobs, okay? Outbound FDI is an important way that U.S. firms access foreign markets and exploit U.S. competitiveness. Again, the important point is these multinationals are crucially important to America's engagement in the global economy, okay? Multinationals that are based here, either foreign or domestic owned, mediate more than 80% of U.S. trade, more than 80% of U.S. exports, and more than 80% of U.S. imports. Okay, so these firms are just crucially important to U.S. engagement in the global economy. So now just some facts to kind of scope it out. In terms of inward FDI stock in the United States, there's about $3.6 trillion of U.S. assets owned by foreign firms. Okay, the firms that own these assets in order of importance are the UK, Japan, Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Canada, France, and Luxembourg. That group accounts for 80% of U.S. inward foreign direct investment. We own more abroad than foreigners own here. U.S. outward foreign direct investment stock is about $4.8 trillion. Okay, and again, most of where that is in the same kinds of countries that invest here. It's the high-income countries, right? 70% of U.S. value-added at affiliates is in high-income countries. Okay, in terms of employment at U.S. parent multinationals here in the United States, it's 22 million people, which is about 20% of private labor force in the United States. So that's important. I mean, it's a small number of firms, but they are important in the labor market. And this gives you a sense of how special these firms are. Even though they account for only 20% of employment, they account for 73% of R&D in the United States. Okay, so these are crucially important firms. In terms of U.S. parents' employment overseas, which is a point of conversation, maybe contention, U.S. multinationals employ about 13 million people overseas. So the operations of the multinationals still remain concentrated in the United States. with about 2/3 of the employment, the R&D, the value added, and the capital investment being here in the United States, the other third abroad. And this is in spite of the U.S. only accounting for about 20% of global GDP at this point. So if you think about, if these multinationals are trying to serve the world, the United States only accounts for 20% of that global pie, and they're still doing 2/3 of their activity here. Sure, their presence overseas is growing faster than it is here, but I think that makes sense given that foreign markets, particularly the large, fast-growing BRICS, are growing a lot faster than the United States. In terms of whether investment abroad by multinationals helps or hurts U.S. workers, I think the academic research is not dispositive. Okay, it's really tricky to try to discern what the employment impact is of overseas operations because, as I talked about, there are a variety of motivations for that investment overseas and a variety of channels, and trying to pin down what would have happened if that investment hadn't happened is really difficult, right? Did that investment allow a firm to export some components for assembly later in the foreign direct investment affiliate that it would not have sales it would not have had otherwise, right? Or was it displacing, was it vertical foreign direct investment and displacing domestic activity? So it's really hard for researchers to pin that down. I think to the extent that there is a consensus, it doesn't look damning. Some of the studies say that it's actually complementary, that investment abroad increases employment at U.S. parents. Others is squishier. But to my knowledge, there's not studies that show that this is a really bad thing for U.S. employment. Okay. Again, it's important to remember that FDI is often the only way to serve foreign markets. So, for example, in the service sector, where there are some industries, some services that are difficult to deliver over a distance, this channel of affiliates is really important. So U.S. cross-border service exports are about $600 billion. Okay? In terms of service affiliate sales overseas, it's double that. It's $1.1 trillion. Okay? So that channel is really important to U.S. firms. So being able to invest abroad and serve foreign customers is really important in the service sector. It's important in manufacturing too. Research shows that when transport costs are high, firms are more likely to pursue FDI than export. Okay? So last, on inbound foreign direct investment, it's important too, right? It's a way for U.S. companies and workers to sell their technology and skills. Inbound FDI helps strengthen the U.S. economy by supporting high-skill, high-wage jobs and supporting R&D. Okay, so in terms of employment, affiliates of foreign multinationals employ almost 6 million people in the United States. That's about 5% of the labor force. Okay, they tend to pay higher wages. Average wages at these affiliates is 20% higher than the average in manufacturing. Okay, and these foreign affiliates, affiliates of foreign multinationals, in spite of only being about 5% of employment, they do 15% of the R&D. So if you add up the R&D by these multinationals, it's close to 90% of the R&D, private R&D pursued in the United States. Okay? In addition, these foreign affiliates in the U.S. accounted for almost 20% of U.S. merchandise exports. So these are important too, right? This is an important channel for U.S. intellectual property to be sold to foreign firms. It's an important way for foreign companies to reach U.S. consumers. Okay, that's why a lot of foreign companies are interested in pursuing foreign direct investment in the United States. Importantly, growing interest by the Chinese to invest in the United States, and I hope we can touch on that more in the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Brad. Christine, and I remind you to push the button to light the green light.
Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks to the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, and to Brad as well for organizing this event and others like it. I'm very pleased to be here today and to join the other panelists. My comments are going to first probably cover some of the territory that Brad did in a more general way, just in terms of the benefits that we see from both inbound and outbound investment, and which is very much a foundation of the administration's U.S. trade and investment policy. We start with the simple fact that 95% of the world's consumers are located outside the United States. And so the challenge is, how do our companies and workers take advantage of the opportunity to sell their products and services to those consumers, as well as to meeting domestic demand. And so the reality, as Brad explained, is that they have to both export and then, in certain circumstances, depending on transportation costs and other factors, policy barriers, or the product itself or the market itself, they need to also invest if they're to take advantage of those opportunities. I also wanted to highlight the fact that I think it's important, and I think this understanding has grown over the years, that the motivation to invest abroad by U.S. companies, goods and service suppliers, is not as simple as a search for lower wages. It's far more complex than that. And in fact, if you look to the fact, again, as Brad noticed, that most 70% of USDI goes to high-income developed markets, like the European member states, such as UK and Germany, not developing country, low-wage countries. I think that's a pretty powerful demonstration just of the complexity and the motivation behind the decision to invest where exporting from the United States may not be practicable. In terms of key benefits overall from investment, both inward and outbound, I think there are three principal ones that we look at. One is the way in which investment, both inflow and outflow, promotes U.S. jobs. And here the case, I think, is very, very compelling. In terms of outbound investment, as Brad noted, there are more than 22 million U.S. jobs that are the result of outflows, accounting for about 20% of U.S. employment. And the compensation of these workers is, on average, 19% more than the average for the rest of the private sector. So, again, if you just look at the U.S. companies that are investing abroad, the picture of their employees is a positive one. If you look then at the importance of inbound investment, which is also very key and informs the administration's policy, the U.S. is the top global destination for global inbound investment. This investment, again, comes primarily from developed countries, from Europe, Canada, and Japan. And much of this investment is concentrated in about 4 or 5 states, interestingly enough, Texas, California, New York, and Illinois. And about 98% of this investment is from private firms. And roughly about 2% of this is from what would be state-owned or controlled entities. So the overwhelming bulk of what's coming into the United States in investing and creating U.S. jobs is from private sources. Now, U.S. subsidiaries that are operating in the United States that are headquartered overseas employ more than 5.5 million people, 5% of U.S. jobs, as Brad noted, and their compensation is, on average, 33% higher than the average for the rest of the private sector. And interestingly, 40% of this inbound investment in the United States is in the manufacturing sector. Again, a very important point in terms of the ongoing interest we have in preserving and strengthening our manufacturing base in the United States. Another very important way, and I think this is true for both outbound and inbound, way that investment is making a major contribution to U.S. economic growth is through supply chains. If you look just at the inbound picture and you look at U.S. subsidiaries of foreign companies, they buy locally. And they're spending about 80 cents out of every dollar they spend to buy input in the United States. And so this also has a very important ripple effect in terms of jobs. So again, you can have dueling studies about precise numbers, but Price Waterhouse, in looking at it, estimated that for every one job in direct that a direct job involved in inward investment is associated with another 3 jobs in terms of supply chain effect, and also the effect of those employees spending their paycheck in the United States. So that's a pretty considerable chunk of economic growth and contribution to economic growth once you step back and look at it. The second major way that we see investment being very key to U.S. economic growth is the degree to which foreign investment promotes exports. When firms establish a presence abroad, they create new important sources of demand for exports of U.S. goods and services. And U.S. parent companies with foreign operations, as a result, account for about 45% of U.S. exports. And these subsidiaries of foreign companies account for about an additional 18% of U.S. exports. And then 27% of U.S. goods exports are actually intra-firm transactions. So the business between companies themselves is also an important source of U.S. exports. The third key economic benefit is that foreign investment promotes capital investment in research and development in the United States. And again, I think this is something that Brad touched on, but U.S. parent companies with foreign operations account for nearly 30% of private capital investment in the United States. And that's a pretty significant number. And a further $68 billion is reinvested in the U.S. by these subsidiaries. So they're not only bringing money in, they're making money and then reinvesting a large chunk of it in the United States. And the purchases that they're making in terms of property, plant, and equipment also spread the employment benefits of their operations well beyond the parent firms and their subsidiaries and throughout the U.S. economy. U.S. parent companies with foreign operations account for about 74% of the research and development performed in the United States. So again, a huge contribution to one of the areas that we know the United States is known for and is really keeping us competitive in global markets. U.S. subsidiaries of foreign companies account for about another 15% of the research and development performed in the United States. So inbound, outbound, those investors in the United States are, again, making major contributions through the capital equipment they buy, the property that they buy, and the research and development that they're doing here. So how do we, as the U.S. government, try and capture these benefits of foreign investment? Well, I think that the foundation of our policy is the U.S. open investment policy that is longstanding and that President Obama has affirmed most recently in 2011. And one of the ways in which I think we've seen a more near-term benefit and positive effect of that is the resurgence of inshoring, where you do see major companies making decisions that for a variety of reasons they're finding that it may be better in competitive terms for them to bring some of their operations back into the United States. So some major companies, whether it be Ford, Caterpillar, Whirlpool, BMW, Siemens, have increased their investments in U.S. facilities and in training. And certainly the Obama administration is trying to encourage that. Bob mentioned Select USA as being one program on the federal level, but of course the states and cities themselves are even more active on a daily basis in terms to attract both U.S. investment back to the United States as well as welcoming foreign inbound investment. I will mention just briefly, again, because I think some of the other panelists may touch on it, but it is an important aspect of U.S. policy with respect to inbound investment, and that's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which USTR sits on. It's been around since 1975, and the purpose is really to screen foreign acquisitions of U.S. firms to look at national security concerns. And it is designed to be narrowly tailored to focus on national security concerns solely. And that's what we have fought very hard as a member of the CFIUS committee to make sure that it continues to do to this day. And I will say, just make a general statement that by and large, the vast majority of transactions that go through CFIUS go through with no restrictions or mitigation. So certainly you may hear about the high-profile cases, but on a day-to-day basis, there are many, many, many that are reviewed by the committee and go through without restriction. Let me turn now more to the focus on outbound investment and what we're doing there to pursue the removal of investment barriers and also to provide protections for U.S. investors when they go abroad. We have 41 bits that are in force. We've reviewed the model bit text that we used twice, once in 2004, and then we completed our most recent review last year. In terms of core provisions, what does that agreement do? And it's also the same provisions are ones that we use in the investment chapter of our FTA. So just wanted to highlight the protections. First of all, there's non-discriminatory treatment that's provided under both our national treatment and MFN obligations. Investors and investments are given fair and equitable treatment and full protection and security in accordance with customary international law. There's a right of prompt compensation in the event of direct or indirect expropriation. There's a right to freely transfer funds related to investments in and out of the host country where the investment is occurring. There are restrictions on the imposition of performance requirements such as local content quotas or export quotas as a condition of investment. There's a right to engage senior management and board of directors of your choice, regardless of nationality. There's a right to enforce these obligations through either the state-to-state mechanism or the investor-state dispute settlement provisions. And finally, there are very significant transparency provisions. Now, these core provisions cover the full life cycle of the investment from when you're seeking to make the investment, what we call pre-establishment, to actually establishing, operating your investment to the point at which you decide to dispose of a particular operation. Now, what we have tried to do in administering the BIT program and our investment provisions in our FTAs is to keep a balance between the protection of investor rights, which is achieved through the core rights that I mentioned, and the state-to-state and investor-state provisions, and the government's ability to regulate in the public interest. And we have taken very seriously all of the stakeholder input that we'd gotten in the 2004 review and the review we completed last year, from private sector to NGOs, members of Congress, and staff. We take very seriously the importance of really achieving that balance, and we think we've achieved it. So we do not see in pursuing our BITs or the investment chapters in our FTAs as a zero-sum game where it's pro-investor and it has a blind eye to our regulatory interests. We really do see that balance as being critically important. And that's why in our March 2012 review, when we announced the results of a more recent review, we preserved that balance in terms of investor protections and the right to regulate, but we enhanced provisions on transparency. We added enhanced provisions on labor and environment because those are clearly very important greater objectives for this administration in particular. And finally, we also strengthened provisions relating to state-owned entities. So those were the three areas where we thought strengthened provisions made sense. Now, I wanted just to say briefly to respond to some of the major concerns, because I know this panel is about both the benefits, which are considerable, but also the concerns that have been raised about investment. First, I think the most common one are concerns that are raised about the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism and the degree to which it can undermine our domestic regulators' right to regulate and have a chilling effect. The fact is that this chilling effect, as far as we can see, has not occurred. To date, there have been 7 cases brought against the United States that have been resolved through final decision, all under NAFTA and all in favor of the United States. And I think it's important to point out that even if we did lose a case, we'd be directed to pay compensation, but we would not be required to change the measure at issue. And I think that's a very important point that people forget. So again, the chilling effect, as we see it, of investor state overall has simply not occurred. And one of the reasons that we think it has not occurred is that there are numerous safeguards that we built into the dispute settlement process and our US FTA investment chapters that we think really guard against that. For example, non-disputing parties can make submissions to arbitral tribunals regarding the interpretation of the FTA. So if you're sitting on the sidelines, you're not a party to dispute, but you have a concern about the matters that are at issue, you can make a submission to the tribunal. 2, tribunals can accept amicus curiae submissions from the public and NGOs, which is another very important and transparent way that non-parties can make their views known. There are also procedures in place, much like those available under the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, that allow for expedited reviews of frivolous claims. So again, investor state, there's ways that we've controlled the risk that investor state can be an avenue for frivolous claims brought against the government. Parties also get interim reviews of arbitral awards. So again, if there are concerns that you have early on as a party, you can express those during the interim review of the arbitral award. There are also other mechanisms, such as issuing binding interpretations at various points in the review. You can also consolidate claims that have common questions of fact and law. And there are other mechanisms, but my point here is that this is a well thought out area where we really have tried to build in a number of safeguards, and in our view, they work pretty well if you look at the track record. Another claim that's brought up that raises the concerns in minds of some is that U.S. investment provisions could provide greater substantive rights to foreign investors than they do to U.S. investors. And the fact of the matter is that the FTA investment protections in our BITs and in our FTAs are based on the same fundamental rights already afforded to Americans and foreigners alike under U.S. law, including under the Takings Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution and under certain parts of the Administrative Procedure Act. And so we clearly were acting in consonance with Congress's guidance in the Trade Act of '72, which said that we were to negotiate agreements ensuring that foreign investors in the United States receive no greater substantive rights than U.S. investors. So we have that mandate, and we live up to it. An additional concern that's been raised is that the investment provisions somehow jeopardize U.S. environment, public health, and safety regulations. And again, similar to some of the safeguards that I raised in investor state, we think that there are additional safeguards that protect against this risk. For example, the in-like circumstances standard that's included in both the BITs and the investment chapters ensures that the national treatment provisions and MFN obligations don't impinge on government measures unless it's for legitimate reasons. And we think that that's a very important protection. I know my time is limited, so let me just say, and turning quickly, that we, in terms of the program that we have now in place to pursue the ways in which U.S. foreign direct investment is limited in markets, we have BIT negotiations ongoing with China, India, Mauritius, and exploratory discussions with a host of countries. We've just begun with Cambodia. We're starting with the EAC group in Africa, Ghana, and Gabon. We have ongoing discussions with Russia, and we look for opportunities for other countries who step up and express interest. We also are pursuing the same types of protections in our TPP investment negotiations with a group of 11 TPP countries, soon with Japan joining. And we intend to pursue similar protections with the Europeans in the TTIP negotiations. So with that, let me conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Sorry to rush you there at the end. Linda?
Thank you very much, and I want to thank you, Bob, and Georgetown for asking me to participate on this panel today. Hello, everyone. Taking time out for lunch here. Hopefully I can give you some comments that make it interesting. First of all, I just want to say that I'm representing the United Steelworkers, and that's the largest industrial union in North America. We've got 1.2 million members, and 850,000 of them are actively employed across every industrial sector one could imagine. We mine various things. We produce petrochemicals, oil, gas. We refine. We make steel. We make steel products. We make paper and paper products. We make glass. We make tires. I could go on and on. We're literally everywhere. We're at the heart and soul of manufacturing. And I would say at the outset, we have thousands of union members that work for U.S. subsidiaries of foreign companies. So we're not opposed to foreign direct investment in the United States. And I'm really going to make my remarks about foreign direct investment in the United States. So a lot of time, these are our best employers. And I think part of the reason why the wages are higher with some of these companies, as has been remarked, is because a lot of them are unionized. But in thinking about foreign direct investment in the United States, I'm kind of reminded of Aristotle, all right, and his admonition to try to steer between the extremes and come to a golden mean, to try to keep things in balance, right? No matter, to me, an approach to life, an approach to this issue. So approaching this subject, I think it would be prudent to do the same thing. It can't be the right answer to simply be in favor of foreign direct investment no matter what the cost, or even worse, and not to even recognize that there may be costs and there may be downsides to the country. For example, there's a possible FDI bill that's been floating around in Congress for a couple of sessions. I think it's very ill thought out, because under it you'd be having a study that would actually assess whether a clean environment or food safety standards or workplace standards that protect workers and communities from spills or explosions, whether or not that might be harmful to having foreign direct investment here. Would really disagree with that, and that would be imprudent to take over 100 years worth of efforts to become a country where we do have clean water and a relatively clean environment and good workforce rules, et cetera, and put that on a downward trajectory. So I disagree with the rather extreme assessment then that foreign direct investment is actually being discouraged, as some are saying, in the United States, and it's going to decline unless we take some direct action. And that would be, as I've just described, to maybe weaken well-established rules that are there for a purpose. So first, let's keep it in perspective. And as was just stated, the U.S. is the top destination for foreign direct investment. It ranks number 4th out of 185 countries, according to the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business estimate, or index. So the United States is hardly an inhospitable environment for foreign direct investment. Okay. And while some may claim that the U.S. might not be attracting as much foreign direct investment as we have been or lately, we're still attracting a very large amount, which we believe is going to grow for several reasons. Most obviously, our overabundance of natural gas and our increase in oil production. These are competitive game changers, and we think they're going to be huge drivers for our economic growth, and they're going to lead to greater foreign direct investment here, and as we would say, inshoring back. We've seen some of our chemical companies come back, as well as other companies that we represent. This could be a good thing. Now, of course, it all has to be in the context of a safe way to do it. That everyone hopefully would agree with that. But this gives the United States an extreme competitive advantage, at least in the manufacturing sector, where, you know, many of them are capital intensive and you need a lot of electricity to run it. So next, to state the obvious, this is a highly developed rule of law nation. And that's not to be underestimated when we look around the world today, right? We have a highly skilled and flexible workforce, and that shouldn't be underestimated. So I guess my bottom line on efforts to try to maybe race to the bottom to make sure we get enough foreign direct investment in the United States are just imprudent. We don't need to race to the bottom to attract FDI, and we shouldn't, because that would be going to the extreme, and we don't need to do that, and we shouldn't do that. It doesn't seem prudent either to us that you would be using increased levels of FDI flowing to developing countries as some kind of a yardstick which would measure our share in the United States of foreign direct investment. As others said today, this is to be expected. These are developing nations. They grow faster as opposed to more developed, mature economies like ours. As the adage goes, it's all relative. So let's keep that in perspective and not do something foolish or really imprudent. So generally speaking, as long as foreign direct investment in the U.S. doesn't undermine our well-established system, government, our health, our workplace, our environment, and doesn't create a race to the bottom, then, in wages or our standard of living in generally, then it should be fine. I'd note that offshoring of jobs and production is a problem, and I'd be glad to discuss that outbound investment if we take questions. However, back to inbound investment, I don't mean to say that there aren't risks or downsides to foreign direct investment in the United States. There can be. And my union and many others are deeply concerned about a specific form of foreign direct investment. And that's what happens with state-owned enterprises when they're investing in the United States. We're now facing a new and growing challenge from state-owned enterprises. The number of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, in the world is dramatically rising. And a state capitalist model is being used by many to develop economically. Other developing nations are seeing it and starting to use it as a model. A 2012 report in The Economist describes an alarming revival with examples from Malaysia, Singapore, China, which is one of the biggest SOE countries. And you can also look at Global Trends 2025, A Transformed World by the National Intelligence Council. So this trend is expected to continue for the foreseeable future. I think, therefore, that we have legitimate concerns from our perspective, and also so does the OECD, and so does the administration in some regards, about what's going to be the role of state-owned economies, state-owned enterprises here in our economy, as well as the world, frankly, that others will talk about. Where they're engaged in commercial activities in the United States market, there could be a big problem if the state-owned enterprise is receiving various competitive advantages from their home government that aren't generally available on commercial terms. Benefits that can benefit their operations and then put everyone else in the marketplace in the United States who competes against them at a disadvantage. So they could be getting subsidies, direct subsidies from their home government by the way of below-cost loans, less than a market loan, or inputs, or just equity infusions to their business operations to keep them running. As you can see, that would be very difficult to compete against essentially a country when you're just a private actor in the marketplace and you're taking regular market signals to conduct your business, right? You want it to be a level playing field. This is essentially anathema to open and fair competition to the U.S. if SOEs are engaging in that kind of behavior. And really for the world, because when you have your multinationals, for example, in China, competing, they have a lot of problems with state-owned enterprises in China that are Chinese-owned for a lot of the same reasons and more that I think will be described by others. So essentially, we think this economic growth model, which is very different from an open market-based system, right, existing in the United States and the developed world, where private actors, they're controlling their assets, they're controlling the capital, and they're competing based on quality, performance, and subject to the forces of supply and demand. That's what we would like to see in our marketplace. That's what we've worked really hard over 100 years to break up the trusts and try to get an open, free marketplace as best as possible. And instead, if a home government gets to give its largesse to its state-owned enterprise that's deciding to now go offshore and go outbound and invest in the United States, then I think we've got to be really careful. And we've got to be looking at how is it being financed? Is it going to be competing, without any largesse from the government, but just in a fair basis as private actors compete? That's a real concern, and it's a growing concern. And I think you could read the Wall Street Journal any day and you're going to see an article about it. So this is not going away. I've been dealing with this issue for several years. It's growing, and we should be prudent. We don't want to be extremists about it or think that the sky is falling, but we have to recognize this is a peril, and we have to deal with it while we can, before all of a sudden, 10 years from now, we find out that a lot of assets are owned by possibly a government that is controlling the state-owned enterprise and doesn't always have the interest of just profit in mind, but maybe wanting technology to transfer that back to the home country, maybe wanting a natural resource to secure that for the home country, or maybe wanting just other governmental aims, which is not how our private industry would like to think typically operates. So with that in mind, that context, we want to ensure competition is open and fair when state-owned enterprises are involved. Again, we can't compete against countries. We just can't be expected to do that here. And I would just mention two things. The bilateral investment treaty with China is now in negotiation. I would disagree that there are strong disciplines on state-owned enterprises in that bilateral investment treaty right now. We would urge the administration to work with us and to strengthen these disciplines so that we can have a real assessment of when an SOE is investing here or making a greenfield here that is happening, that we're going to be able to compete with them fairly in this marketplace. And again, I'd be glad to take any questions on outward bound FDI if you have them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. That's great. John.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for Georgetown for sponsoring. Since you're all involved in the policy-making process, I'll put my comments through that policy prism. For starters, everything's global now. Goods, services, investments are flowing around the world. I think there's a lot of evidence. You heard some of it in this panel that flow of goods, services, and investments across the planet is a good thing. The U.S., I think, benefits long-term greatly from having an open investment policy. It's not to say that we shouldn't regulate for the health and welfare and environment for our country, but we should do that irrespective of whether those are U.S. dollars or foreign dollars coming in. There shouldn't be a distinction. Open markets, I think, are best because there's a lot of evidence that shows that individuals are better allocators of capital than governments. I mean, unless there's a market failure, we obviously all came here on public roads that wouldn't be there if public dollars weren't used to create those roads. But when it comes to private investments that private investors are willing to make, individuals who bear that risk are going to allocate that capital better. There is no way to restrict outbound investment, as far as I can tell, unless this country took a very different turn. We're not in the business of telling people where they can invest, and that's a good thing. I'll speak first about the rest of the world and then come back to some U.S. investment policies. If you look around the world, the rest of the world is not nearly as open as we are. Almost invariably, those investment restrictions reflect some form of political favoritism. Like in every country, political favoritism always gets dressed up as serving some great public interest, but rarely is it. There are forces that were able to exert their power on the political system. The jobs have been mentioned in the trade context and investment context. Jobs numbers get thrown around routinely. Nearest I can tell, investment flows, trade flows change the mix of jobs, but ultimately unemployment rates are dictated by macroeconomic factors, and we should not fall prey to these arguments that somehow this policy or that policy is going to diminish jobs, because I don't think the weight of evidence is there. We should focus, if we want to focus on employment policies, we should focus on education, tax policies, education policies. Those are the real drivers of the unemployment rate, not trade and investment policy, in my humble opinion. Let's talk about the rest of the world. You can get this report on, if you just Google U.S. Chamber of Commerce, China's approval process. This is a report that, at the risk of being immodest, Covington and Burling, we drafted for the Chamber last year. It goes through the approval process for different investments in China. As you can see, it's not a slender pamphlet. It has lots of diagrams that look fairly difficult, and they are. China would benefit itself from having more open investment policies, but they're very difficult in many instances. I think there's a growing recognition that those policies hurt China, but we're not there yet. Christine is in the business, along with her colleagues at USTR, of trying to create better rules for the globe. A lot of our economic and political problems in the context of globalization stem from the fact that we don't often have global rules. 100 years ago, when if we were sitting in this room, we would have been dealing with the fact that the U.S. economy was moving from predominantly a local economy to a national economy. And when that occurred, we needed to create national governance. So, if you will, if you've got a 9 by 12 room, that's the economy. You need 9 by 12 regulation, and that doesn't mean you need to be overly prescriptive in that regulation, but it has to capture it. And right now we have a global economy that's 9 by 12, and we have a global governance that's maybe at best 6 by 9. And a lot of stuff is happening that is either too restrictive or not regulated enough. And that's the process that I think investment rules, other trade rules, I think are in the process of continuing to evolve to try to right-size global governance with the global economy. But the fact that the U.S. could be open and other countries could be much less open is a problem. I will say for my own evolution in thinking, there was a time where I thought, well, if other countries want to restrict inbound investment, that's bad for them, but doesn't hurt us. I do think there's a more open question now. We have global supply chains. It's a fair question whether your business model is impaired if you are restricted from operating fully and completely in all markets. And if an investor in this country has access to their home market unrestricted, the rest of the world largely unrestricted, but we face restrictions in their large markets, I think it's a fair question, frankly, whether we need to look at rules to address that. Bilateral investment treaties, I think, are wonderful tools that protect investors in foreign markets against bad acts in those countries, so you're not subject to local courts to redress those bad acts. So I think BITs are wonderful things, but I think those address retail problems, and we may need to think about how to address some wholesale problems associated with asymmetry in investment policies around the world. Let me turn for a moment to the U.S. On the inbound side. So as the other panelists have noted, and you probably already know, we're a huge destination for inbound investment, primarily because we're a great place to invest. I think even in the course of the Great Recession, globally, a lot of investors thought, well, the U.S. isn't in great shape, but it's a better long-term bet than most markets. So our investment policy has served us well, but most of the investment flows have been a reflection of good economic sense. We have a few, in my humble opinion, blind spots in terms of our investment policy. There's some areas, some sectors where foreign investment is treated differently. You can invest in certain transportation markets, certain media markets, but those are frankly minor, even if reasonable minds can disagree about those restrictions. In the scheme of things, they are pretty inconsequential. What gets most of the attention is this CFIUS process that many of you may be familiar with, and that is a process. It's voluntary, but it's companies that are acquiring U.S. assets. U.S. going concerns are well advised to take advantage of that voluntary process. If there's any potential argument that investment could somehow impair or threaten to impair U.S. national security, the good news is that process, in both my experience as being part of it when I was in government and since then as a practitioner assisting companies in it, the focus is on national security. Even if people can disagree about whether a threat is real or is being overstated, there's a high degree of integrity in that process. Policymakers do not mix into this broad national security discussion economic interests or other interests. And that's different. A lot of countries do put investments through an economic interest test filter. The U.S. doesn't, even if individuals want to disagree with some of the decisions on CFIUS. I don't think it's fair to suggest that the process isn't focused exclusively on security interests. Since Dubai Ports World, that some of you may be familiar with, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, that was the perfect storm in terms of this CFIUS, which 8 people in America knew of before Dubai Ports became very familiar with it, and brought a lot of attention to the process. And I think one of the consequences of it was, and I say this as a former senior political appointee, so I say it with all due respect to all senior political appointees of whatever stripe, I think that became such a politically complex quagmire that since then, senior political people want to stay away from CFIUS matters. And as a result, I think career people are left with a very difficult situation whereby they are expected to scrub every transaction and assure their higher-ups that there is no conceivable risk associated with this transaction. And I think it's an unfair and extremely challenging burden. And I hope it will right itself over time, but I think it's very challenging right now. And our focus should be on net and marginal risk. I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago that talked about CFIUS process, I noted, I gave as an example, you don't have to buy an airline to hijack a plane. And there are many scenarios where if bad actors really wanted to accomplish a certain goal, query, do they need to make this acquisition to achieve those goals, or would there be much less visible, much less expensive ways to do that? And if so, I think that should be part of the equation. But however reasonable minds may disagree about certain outcomes in CFIUS, I would still say that the process is has far more integrity than the process of inbound investment screens that other countries have, and we are greatly benefited from the fact that when the CFIUS process was incorporated by statute in FINSA 6-7 years ago, that there was a rejection of a proposal by some that FINSA include an economic interest test. And if every inbound investment went through an economic interest test, I worry about the politicization of that process. So why don't I close my remarks here?
Well, thank you very much. This has been an exceptionally rich conversation, and I'm really happy that it's been captured on video so that people can review it. Tell me, Andrea, the center, this will appear on the center's website? About how many days does it take to get up? Good. Well, it's really been great. You guys have been terrifically informative. We've covered a huge range of huge ground. I was looking at a map of Yellowstone Park the other day. I've never been there. It covers trillions of acres, and maybe this is analogous. But we do have a little time for some questions, and I want to note in the audience a dear friend of international trade, Sophia King, who is still working, I believe, for Congressman Meeks of New York, one of the great voices for trade investment liberalization in the Congress. Sophia's got a question. She's always got a great question.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, just very briefly, you're absolutely right. There is a gap, and that's why when we were able to finally launch BIT negotiations with China, we saw that so critically important. So, if you look at how far the gap reaches, when it comes to investment, certainly in the services context, there are rules that deal with, in the world of services, what's called commercial presence or Mode 3. So to some extent, in the case of China, where it has made commitments that cover Mode 3 or commercial presence investment, we would have the availability of dispute settlement to bring a case that might have investment aspects, again, if it's a sector in which they have made commitments. Now, the same would be the case with Russia, and it would be principally in the services area where we would have the availability of dispute settlement vis-a-vis commercial presence or Mode 3. But that, certainly the degree to which we cover commercial presence in the GATT sense is far more limited because, one, its services doesn't reach goods, agriculture, very, very key sectors. I think in our minds, certainly that the China bit is still foremost in terms of our bit program priorities in terms of moving forward. We've had 10 rounds with the Chinese, about to have the 11th, hoping to schedule that soon. And we really are on the verge of being able to get through our presentation of our new revised model bit and getting to the point where we could have a bracket of text with the Chinese. And, I still think it's going to take a considerable bit of time, but be in a position to where we could really get into hard negotiation of the substance and then to market access, which is really where, we would hope breakthroughs could be made. And the publication that John and his firm worked on with the Chamber certainly points to one area where, in the context of perhaps, more on the market access phase of the negotiations, we could try and tackle the layers of the investment approval process with respect to China. So it's critically important. Russia, we're farther down the road. We've had to do a bit of chasing them in terms of getting them to sit down with us to talk about our model bit, but we're not giving up in that respect. But the bottom line is, yes, it should be a continually at the top of our list in terms of trying to get Russia to sit down and be able to formally launch negotiations, so we do close that gap.
Back here.
I'd like to also commend the panel for a great discussion. If I seem a little defensive, it's because I'm the chief counsel of the subcommittee that has the legislation that Linda referred to, this year's version. But, we've made a couple changes to it that I think you will like, and in particular, the thrust of the legislation now. First of all, it emphasizes the positive as well as any uncompetitive aspects of U.S. policy. It does not, it's not a one-sided thing that's inviting a race to the bottom. But I think maybe more significantly from the standpoint of what you're getting at, it now calls for the administration to look at policies that are closely linked the U.S. competitiveness in the global environment for foreign direct investment. And it asks, at the end of the study, it asks the administration to make recommendations to the Congress about how to improve U.S. competitiveness without undermining basic environmental, labor, and other protections. And that's a quote. So without undermining. That's the challenge to the administration, is to see if there are ways to improve our competitiveness in the global environment for foreign direct investment without undermining those protections. So I think we've possibly addressed the main concern that people have raised about the version that went through the House on a voice vote last year.
Well,
Will you take a look at it?
I think I just did, but I'd be glad to take another look at it. And I was trying to make the broader point that does the Congress honestly believe that we're going to be losing foreign direct investment in the United States? I think it's the opposite. I think we're going to be growing it, and
Just in the last year.
but just in the last year.
But just in the last year, the United States has actually fallen to second. Okay, so it used to be 47% of foreign direct investment came to the United States. Now it's 19%. We're no longer number one. Just barely in the last year, we've slipped to number two. So the issue is, and I agree with several people made the comment that it's to be expected that China and India, Brazil, and other developing nations will get a larger percentage of foreign direct investment. So we shouldn't expect to continue to have 50%. That's true. On the other hand, we shouldn't neglect to find out if there are important policies that are degrading our competitiveness.
Well, thank you, and I will look at it again. I just say that some in Congress want to use this as a tool to really unwind regulations in any way they can, and this is a tool. And again, think back to Aristotle and trying not to be extreme, trying to address a real problem. I don't think it's a real problem whatsoever. No one on this panel has said that it is a problem. And I just ask you, proceed with caution. Just don't look at a year of data. I think it's going to grow myself because we do have some of these advantages now. But I'll definitely look at it again. But frankly, that's how it struck me, and I've read it twice.
Okay, well, that's a good exchange of views. There's a question here and one there, and we have about 10 minutes, so do you want to start? Okay.
Irene Wu from the Federal Communications Commission. I know we have several experts on service.
Well, services is a huge part of both what comes in and in terms of investment and what goes out. I mean, the services sector is a huge growth area in general. It's also, the growth is also hidden to the degree that if you look at the supply chain piece, it's also a huge part of growth in manufacturing too. So yes, I think that the points that I made about the importance of investment to the U.S. economy and the ways that in which has a positive effect would definitely apply to services as much as it would to goods. Just in terms of an area that you're very close to and one where we're doing a lot of work, and that's sort of the combination of computer and related services, telecom, and e-commerce. Where there's just an explosion in terms of really electronically enabled services. And so we're doing a lot of work, and it does relate to investment, to make sure that as investment expands in this area, whether it's you want to set up an ISP, you want to store data, that the free flow of data is not interrupted. I mean, certainly there are considerations which we would respect and not want ignored, like consumer protection, national security, things like that. And also would be concerned that things like where you're required to locate your data server would not impede the ability to provide those services, again, with respect to respecting national security issues, consumer protection. Those, I think, are more specific challenges that may be investment related in a services sector in particular, and challenges that we see right now. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Brad, do you want to comment on the services point?
Yeah, these things are important across all sectors, but even more in services. And I think part for the reasons that Christine explained, and in part because I'm not sure those of us in the research community or the policy community yet really have a good mental model of how services firms do export, right? We talk about mode 3 as if it's distinct from mode 1, which is cross-border provision. Yet my growing sense is in talking to firms is that you probably need both, right? You probably need a commercial presence to support your exports from the U.S. So that makes these investment provisions even more important, because it's an important channel through which we do the cross-border part. It's really hard to put a number on that because there's no data. But my sense is that this is crucially important. You kind of need all 4 of the modes working in concert. Probably to different degrees across industries, but these business platforms are evolving rapidly, and this commercial presence has to be crucial.
Yeah, down here.
Dan Finelli from Georgetown. Thank you each for being here. Kind of wanted to ask if the U.S. were to foster and encourage further foreign direct investment, what the potential impact or benefit to the U.S. consumers could be, and what the impact could be to weaker.
Well, that's interesting. John, do you want to take a shot at that?
Well, more competition would be better for consumers, right? I mean, there was a time, I say this is the son of someone who worked with the Ford company for many years. The big 3 in Detroit, I'm sure, would have preferred to have no non-U.S. car makers in the market, right? I don't know anyone today who thinks cars that are available to Americans today would be as good as they are if the U.S. market were restricted to the 3 incumbent dominant companies at the time. So the more competition, the better. And does that sometimes mean that domestic firms lose out? Absolutely. But if we don't just accept that as the price of a competitive economy, then we're in the business of everyone in this room who works for a member of Congress is going to have a long line outside their door of people saying, please protect my company from competition. And that competition may be, across the street, maybe across the country, maybe across the globe, but that's not, to me, a regulatory environment that is good for America.
Linda, you want to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to, thanks for the question. I mean, I agree with everything that John has just said. What we don't want to do is lower our standards here to encourage more foreign direct investment. We don't need to do that. In fact, I'd say our highest standards ensures them a rule of law country, a well-developed workforce, infrastructure, et cetera, is a plus, along with what I think is going to be some future growth with our natural gas and oil finds. So I don't think we need to worry about that unless we, as I said, take an unnecessary step in thinking about lowering our standards. It's clear if we lowered our wage rates or lowered different things, more companies would come here. But ultimately, what's a country for? What's a nation for? What's a government for? It's to give the most a decent living standard of living, excuse me. And in terms of competition, yeah, we want a free and open market in the United States. We work for foreign companies. We don't have any problem with that, competing against other companies in the United States. My only issue that I raised today is state-owned enterprises are a problem because they're not competing fairly all the time. We've got to figure out a way so we can determine whether they are or not, and to ensure that when they come here, they don't engage in behavior that creates an unlevel playing field for the rest of us. That's only fair. We want fair and open competition. No one is asking for anything more.
Good. Time for one quick one?
Bob, can I
Oh,
just
yes,
say one
please.
thing, just because it directly relates
course.
to what Linda was saying, which again, I think we're very much in agreement with as far as not intending or wanting to lower standards. One of the things we did in the revised model bit in the area of labor and environment was to include stronger language than we'd ever had in the agreement, providing that neither the United States nor its bid partner would waive or derogate from either their labor or environment laws and not fail to effectively enforce them, to reaffirm their international commitments in both areas, and then to back that up, we included a strengthened consultation mechanism. So again, I think in a very public way, we reaffirmed our commitment that we had no intention of trying to either lower our own standards or encourage that in foreign markets. In addition, SOEs are, in terms of disciplining SOE conduct, there are a number of ways in which we do that under the BIT in terms of the national treatment provisions. When an SOE is acting under delegated government authority, but also we discipline conduct when a government is trying to impose domestic preference requirements, whether it be conduct or particular technologies that might be to benefit either a state-owned industry or particular sector. And we've gone beyond that, certainly in TPP, specifically in our competition chapter, and specifically with two of the countries, Malaysia and Singapore, that Linda mentioned, we're dealing with. So just want to mention that.
Thanks a lot. Closing comment, anybody? John, do you want to comment? Do you have a comment?
Oh, just one quick clarifying comment. Linda and I seem to agree on that foreign invested dollars should be treated no differently than domestic dollars in terms of the regulatory framework that they face. But we probably disagree, and we won't burden you all with this, as to what the level of domestic regulation should be. I would call much of our current regulatory environment, but that's a separate matter. I don't think, and I'd be interested in learning about this legislation, but my bias is towards because I've seen U.S. investments discriminated against so much in foreign markets, that we should have public interests in mind, and those public interests in a factory, labor conditions, et cetera, should be pursued regardless of the nationality of the dollars invested.
Anybody else? Brad, comment? Christine, Linda? Well, thank you all very, very much. This has been really good. I think the answer to the question posed at the front, is foreign investment good for America, is a resounding yes. I guess I'm a little surprised at the strength of the feeling behind that. And appreciate it a lot. And I think, returning to a point that was made by John, I think the interesting analogy, the metaphor of the room, the 10 by 12 room with, global room with 5 by 5 or 3 by 2 or whatever, 6 by 8 measures of regulatory coherence, regulatory sensibility is a very, very good one. I think we're all struggling here. We like to think we're struggling toward a rule of law that applies to everybody, and in all the markets that in which we engage, and that is the overwhelming enterprise here in trade negotiations and in many other forums in which we all participate. So please join me in thanking an excellent panel, and we'll see you next time.